Nebraska State Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to another of our Brown Bag History Forum lectures. Today we'll be talking about how the water in our tap actually gets there as part of the wider Platte River system, and we're going to be hearing from Michael Farrell. Michael is the television production manager of Nebraska Educational Telecommunications. He also is a faculty member in the Department of the College of Journalism at UNL, and will be talking to us today about where the water comes from.
Thank you, Lynn. I am Mike Farrell. I am a television production manager at NET. I'm also working over at the College of Journalism and Fine and Performing Arts this year with an internship project that we started to bring students into our facility. I've been at NET for 34 years. And although I am an employee of NET, my comments here today are coming to you from me as an individual, not as an employee of NET. This paper that I'm going to give was prepared as a presentation at the Polemics Club about 1.5 years ago. Polemics Club is a small group of argumentative individuals who get together for dinner once a month and discuss topics of current interest and argue and debate about them. So my topic was where the water comes from, and it's a look at issues surrounding the Platte River and its water. And we had that discussion about 1.5 years ago. Since I prepared the talk, a number of things have changed. I'm going to try to give you some updates at the end of the talk, but just bear in mind this is a talk that was prepared for about 1.5 years ago. Now, just before we start in on the talk, I want to give you a little bit of background and find out a few things from you. How many people in the room have ever seen sandhill cranes? Many of you, almost all of you. How many have ever seen a whooping crane? Oh, more than I thought. I've never seen a whooping crane. How many have seen least terns or piping plovers? A few. You must be all bird watchers, and maybe that's why you're here. I saw my first bobcat last night out at Spring Creek Prairie, so there's always something new to see in Nebraska. My first sightings of sandhill cranes took place back in the mid-'70s when I was on a film shoot in western Nebraska, and because I hadn't grown up here, I didn't know about these birds, and I was driving down the interstate with some companions from the TV station, and I said, "What are those huge birds?" Nobody in the car with me knew what these birds were. This was in the mid-'70s, and they were all originally from Nebraska. So I think our awareness of sandhill cranes and the issues surrounding the Platte River have grown a lot since the mid-'70s. I started taking my kids out there in the 70s and 80s. In 1989 and 90, I produced a program called The Platte River Road, which was a 90-minute documentary that looked at the history of the Platte River from Lewis and Clark to the present. That program won the National Cowboy Hall of Fame Award in 1991. Beginning that same year, I started photographing the North Platte River from its mouth where it dumps into the Platte and following it all the way up through Wyoming and into Colorado using a 4x5 camera and then later a 5x7 camera, and making prints which have been shown at the Museum of Nebraska Art, the Center for Great Plains Studies, and at the Wyoming State Museum. I've gone up the Platte every summer since '91, making photographs and visiting all the major historic sites and dams along the way. And it's my photographs that will illustrate the lecture. So, where the water comes from. This talk will be about the water in our glasses and its history. All living things need water. Beyond that obvious point, I want to discuss a couple of issues of political and moral choice that we as Nebraskans and Americans are making and will be called upon to make and to debate and decide in the coming years and decades. First, some context and history. I suppose that most of you already know that the water we drink here in Lincoln comes to us through pipes from the Lincoln Water System's well field in the Platte River near Ashland. So we, like much of the rest of the state, rely on water from the Platte River. But before that water gets to Ashland, it undertakes a long journey. And there are a lot of claims on that water along the way before it gets to our faucets. For me and for us, here is the ultimate source of our water. This is Noku Crags. It's a ridge of mountains in the Never Summer Range in Colorado, and it's about as far as you can go upstream on the North Platte River. I like to think of this place, where I've been many times, as the spiritual headwaters of the river as well. Those peaks are about 11,000 feet above sea level. And I'm going to show you what's right next to them, and then I'm going to show you a panoramic view. Those two photographs are side by side, and there'll be a few of those in this lecture. From here, snowmelt and runoff collect in this lake. This is Lake Agnes, and then they begin their downstream run. Lake Agnes is just behind those big crags, and it's a fantastic, gorgeous place in the Colorado State Forest up on the other side of Cameron Pass in Colorado. Almost all the water in the Platte comes to us from northern Colorado and Wyoming via the North Platte River. Much less of the South Platte's water reaches Nebraska due to the extensive impoundments that provide municipal water for Denver and irrigation water for eastern Colorado. Here's a map that shows the Platte's drainages. Colorado established its legal rights to a majority of the South Platte's water very early in comparison to Nebraska. Consequently, most of our legal squabbles have concentrated on the water from the North Platte. The North Platte rises in an area of Colorado where there is little opportunity for big dams and water projects. It's an open valley surrounded by mountains called North Park, and it's an area that's relatively undeveloped. There are some impoundments and irrigated lands of a small scale. Most of the mountains are U.S. Forest Service lands, and much of the valley is cattle ranches and wet hay meadows. A large portion of the valley is a federal wildlife refuge. From high in the mountains, many creeks and smaller rivers drain into the valley and coalesce into the North Platte. This is a little place up on the Continental Divide called Jewel Lake, and its waters run downstream through places like this. This is Jack Creek, a gorgeous area. I've explored the upper reaches of most of these rivers and streams in my 15 years of photographing the North Platte every summer. This is an area that hasn't become a popular tourist designation. There are almost no amenities in the valley and only one town of any size. The North Platte is unusual in that it is a north-running river for a significant portion of its length. As the river leaves Colorado, it runs north through an area called Northgate Canyon into southern Wyoming. These aren't pictures of Northgate Canyon. It's almost impossible to get into Northgate Canyon. It's a formidable landscape that I have yet to explore. Almost all the river access through that region is in private hands. Throughout southern Wyoming, the North Platte runs in and out of a succession of rocky canyons and gentle valleys, home mostly to cattle ranches and BLM lands. It's relatively unimpeded in this region that extends roughly to the point where Interstate 80 crosses it near Rawlins, Wyoming. There, the river is still running northward, but shortly it enters a much different geography, one of steep-sided granite canyons and rugged sagebrush desert terrain. It is in these precincts that we'll find most of the big federal dams, and it is in the history and present tense reality of these water management projects that we'll find the biggest disagreements and strongest polemical stands taken. There are three big dams and reservoirs between I-80 and Casper, Wyoming: Seminole, Pathfinder, and Alcova. We'll get to those in a couple of minutes, and a couple of little ones too, Cortez and Gray Reefs. But first, let's go into the history of water management on the Platte. The history of water management on the Platte is basically a story of political friction between states, in this case Wyoming and Nebraska, and a century of federal policy intent on, this thing is doing its own thing. And it must be because I'm stepping on the wires. Let's see if we can't. Take us back where we belong. And I will try not to step on the wires. The history of water management on the Platte is basically a story of political friction between the states, in this case Wyoming and Nebraska, and a century of federal policy intent on promoting settlement, subsidizing cheap food, and mitigating the friction between the states. Early in the settlement period, during the late 1860s and 70s, the western lands of the Nebraska Panhandle and eastern Wyoming were free-range cattle country. In the 1880s, homesteaders tried their hands along the river bottoms, but without great success. The Homestead Act of 1862 was put into effect before the nature of the West's weather and water was really understood. 160 acres of western land was a recipe for failure unless it was bottomland. Out on the plains, the North Platte drains an arid land that averages less than 20 inches of annual rainfall. That's the generally accepted rainfall dividing line between non-irrigated and irrigated agriculture. Most community leaders and politicians in the later years of the 19th century understood that economic viability for the region was going to depend on large-scale irrigation. When Wyoming entered the Union in 1889, her state constitution claimed that all of the North Platte's waters belonged to Wyoming. Naturally, Nebraska went to court. This was a scene repeated throughout the West as states fought with each other over other rivers that had existed for eons and flowed without regard to such human conventions as state lines. An earlier water squabble in California had prompted Mark Twain to quip, "Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting," a quote that now must be worked into every water story, including mine. Twain's contemporary, Major John Wesley Powell, that one-armed Civil War veteran and Western explorer who in 1869 first ran the Colorado through the Grand Canyon and 12 years later became the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, had suggested that political boundaries in the arid West be organized along watersheds. It was Powell's 1879 report that defined the 100th meridian and the 20-inch annual rainfall line as the boundary west of which irrigation would be necessary for crop agriculture. He also recommended that settlement should be delayed until regional irrigation projects and co-ops for the use of the resource could be developed. Too bad they didn't. The interstate water development issues on the North Platte were tied up in litigation for most of the disastrous, drought-ridden 1890s. By that decade, the Wyoming-Nebraska border region had about 2,000 small dams and private irrigation projects siphoning off water during the growing season. But the river ran dry at the critical times, and now the two states were battling to control the North Platte's remaining water. Attracting settlers and building a stable regional economy under those circumstances was going to be difficult. In 1902, the federal government, under Teddy Roosevelt, created the U.S. Reclamation Service, today known as the Bureau of Reclamation, and one wonders why they use the word reclamation. One of the new agency's first projects was to find a way to tap the waters of the North Platte for irrigation downstream in eastern Wyoming and western Nebraska. After a lot of engineering and site exploration, work was started on Pathfinder Dam in 1903. It was the second project to be completed by the Bureau of Reclamation in the United States. The dam is located a few miles below the confluence of the Sweetwater River and the North Platte in a canyon where Lieutenant John C. Fremont, exploring in 1842, wrecked his boats and lost his surveying instruments. Fremont was known in his time as the Pathfinder, hence the name for the dam, largely due to the skills of his ghostwriter, his wife, Jessie Benton Fremont, who helped make his report of the 1842 expedition a national bestseller. She was the daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, the U.S. Senator from Missouri, who championed Western expansion. Less known is the fact that a few years later, in 1846, Fremont helped foment the Bear Flag Rebellion in California, and not too much later was nominated as the first Republican candidate for president. I think he'd be a topic for a brown bag of his own at some point. It took 6 years to build Pathfinder Dam. using methods not altogether different from those used to build the great cathedrals of Europe. This is the backside of the dam and the reservoir, and here's those two photos together so you can get a sense of the scope. Stone was quarried on the site. Each block was finished by hand. Supplies like cement, mortar, and foodstuffs were hauled in overland 45 miles by ox train from Casper. The construction crew lived in tents winter and summer. And by the way, 3 men were killed building the dam. A mountainside of trees was felled nearby and burned to keep the steam-powered derricks and cement mixers operating. It was really a pretty remarkable feat considering where it was located. And the first time I visited it, my attitude about the Pathfinder Dam changed. I thought I wasn't going to like it, but I really think it's a very remarkable engineering feat. In any case, east of Casper, the North Platte turns east and south, still in canyon country. Now this is a diagram of the North Platte River, and you can see that it kind of hooks like a big horn there, moving its way east. Near the Wyoming-Nebraska border, the river begins to travel through broader, flatter valleys that could take advantage of large-scale irrigation. While the dam was under construction, work began on a system of diversion dams and canals in eastern Wyoming and western Nebraska that would bring large-scale irrigated farming and relative economic stability to the region. Between 1905 and 1924, over 2,000 miles of canals, laterals, and drains were constructed, and those are in that green shaded area there. Imagine a feather-shaped geographic area that extends for 111 miles from end to end and provides irrigation water to about 250,000 acres. Without Pathfinder Dam, the Fort Laramie and interstate canals and their attendant irrigation projects, the towns of Torrington, Wyoming, Scottsbluff, Gering, and Mitchell, Nebraska, wouldn't have fared very well. These irrigated lands made possible the sugar beet industry and attracted Germans from Russia and Mexican migrants and settlers. Beans also became a big crop, as did irrigated corn for cattle feed. Between 1910 and 1920, Scottsbluff's population increased 649%, from 1,746 to 6,912. I was just out in Sioux and Dawes County last week, and when we were coming home, they were harvesting sugar beets. And if you think that sugar beets are a small deal, you should be out there about this time of year when truck after truck, semi-size, comes roaring by with a full load of sugar beets to take them to their processing plants that are on corners out there. When Pathfinder was completed in 1909, the era of big water projects was in its infancy. During the next half century, as technology and know-how improved, a string of big dams and reservoirs was built on the North Platte. The next was Guernsey Dam and Reservoir, downstream from Pathfinder and completed in 1927. It was built to provide control for the North Platte project water and for power generation. Then came the Kendrick Project. It provides irrigation for an area of Wyoming west of Casper and power generation. There are 2 Kendrick Project dams, Alcova, which is downstream from Pathfinder, and Seminole, which is upstream. And I'll show you a few photographs. This is Alcova, and taken in the wintertime, obviously. And Seminole. This is Seminole's reservoir from an overlook. Here's the gatehouse. And here is a panorama of the beginning of the reservoir, which backs up behind the dam. Together, those 2 dams and reservoirs provide over 1 million acre-feet of irrigation and power generation water. Lake McConaughey and Kingsley Dam in Keith County was a project undertaken by Central Nebraska Public Power and Irrigation District to supply irrigation water to farmers downstream along the North Platte and in the Platte Valley between North Platte and Minden, constructed between 1936 and 41. It irrigates about 250,000 acres. Unlike the Bureau of Reclamation's projects in Wyoming, this project was funded through a Depression-era Public Works Administration. Although some of the cost of the project was in the form of an outright grant, the majority of the funding was to be repaid. The total cost was $43.5 million. The dam is 3.5 miles across and is capable of holding back 2 million acre-feet of water. And it puts water into irrigation canals like that. After World War II, the Bureau of Reclamation's Pick-Sloan Missouri River Basin project built dozens of dams and reservoirs throughout the Upper Plains region. On the North Platte, another 3 dams were built. Glendo, and this is the power plant below Glendo Dam. It was finished in 1944 and has 500,000 acre-feet. Cortez, and Cortez is that little plug down at the end of that canyon. It's finished in 1951. It's only 4,700 acre-feet, and it was built primarily for power generation. And Gray Reef, and I don't have a photograph of Gray Reef, finished in 1961, the smallest at 1,800 acre-feet, built to regulate in-stream flows between Alcova and other upstream dams, and Glendo and Guernsey downstream. With the completion of the Gray Reef Dam, the complex on the North Platte that we see today was essentially complete. That was in 1961. After a half a century of development, the economic benefit to the region was enormous. In 1998, Nebraska's sugar beet production alone was worth an estimated $33 million. But at the same time, there were costs not as easily calculated as the economic benefits. Over that same half century, the fundamental nature and character of the North Platte and Platte rivers changed enormously. A river is an ecological system of great complexity in its natural state. One might even suggest that it is a living organism in its own right, and others have. When the river's natural flows and cycles of spring flooding and low water in the drier months are altered, the system can no longer function as it evolved. Species are put under pressure as habitat is altered. Here's a picture of the Platte River taken by John Carbot, the Union Pacific construction photographer, in 1866. One of the primary changes to the Platte River in Nebraska is the fact that since the era of the big dams, the river rarely floods. These are channel width maps that indicate how the Platte's channels have narrowed from 1860 to 1998. The Platte, as it crossed the prairie for millions of years, was a braided river with many channels and sandbars that were scoured of vegetation and rearranged within the floodplain each spring as the snowmelt in the Rockies rushed downstream to the plains. Here is a chart that shows the change in daily flow before and after the dams. The spike peaky looking line is before the dams, the flatter line is after the dams. Sediment flows are estimated to have shrunk by about 80%. And where is all that sediment? It's trapped behind the dams, silting in the reservoirs. Guernsey Reservoir is estimated to have silted into about 60% of its original capacity. Channel depth has changed in part from the lack of sediment, but also from the nature of irrigation supply and return. This chart shows how irrigation below McConaughey alters the natural flow, and it would probably take you a while to get this, and I've got a list of website information to pass out after the lecture so you can look these up and take more time with them. Measurements at Overton, where the irrigation waters return to the main channel, show a channel depth increase of 6 feet in the 13-year period from 1989 to 2002. 18 miles downstream, the change is 1 foot, with the depth creeping further downstream yearly. So the river is getting deeper instead of wider. Wet meadows bordering the river, essential to support wildlife, have also been reduced due to the shrinkage of the riverbed, but also due to ditch drainage to create cropland and due to the increase in irrigation wells for center pivots. Since settlement, the wet meadows in the Central Platte Valley have decreased an estimated 73%. From 1938 to 1982, wet meadows declined 45%. Building the interstate also reduced wet meadows in that region. Today, the river is no longer a natural system. The dams and controlled release of water have altered the fundamental nature of the river. Now the riverbanks are covered with trees. The channels are fewer and tend to run deeper. Floods are a rarity, and as a consequence, the sandbars support willows and other vegetation that tend to anchor them within the stream. The river has shrunk in width, channels have dried up and become farmland. It's hard to find stretches that have anything like the mile-wide, open-braided channel, shifting sandbar prairie river character noted by the overland immigrants of the 1840s and 50s. Ultimately, the fundamental quality of the river is still controlled by natural forces. In the past few years, the drought has shown us that even with all of our water management technology, nature still reigns. However, beginning in the 20th century, the water that nature does provide is now locked up and obeys our will. The Platte River system is now a series of big bathtubs and faucets engineered to benefit a human economy. Not everybody agrees that that's a good thing. Perhaps we've gone too far with it and should seriously consider undoing some of what we've done. During the decades that followed the big dam construction period, a new way of thinking emerged in America. That's one of the first photographs I took on the Platte back in the 90s. In 1962, the year that Gray Reefs Dam was completed, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring that chronicled the loss of species due to pesticide use. Public reaction was enormous. Many attribute the founding of the modern environmental movement to that publication. Of course, for decades, there have been groups working to preserve the environment and to raise public awareness of species and habitat issues, notably the Sierra Club. In 1964, the Wilderness Act provided for permanent protection for certain natural areas from development. In 1965, in a famous case, the Sierra Club battled with Walt Disney Productions to prohibit the development of what would have become the nation's largest theme park in Mineral King Valley of California's Sierra Nevada range. After taking the case all the way to the Supreme Court, Disney dropped their plans for the valley. Then in 1969, the Environmental Protection Agency was created, followed by the Clean Air Act of 1970 and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. In just a decade since the publication of Silent Spring, environmentalism developed muscle. The Endangered Species Act was the heavy hitter of the bunch and intimately tied to the present and future of the Platte River. The Act's purpose is to protect endangered or threatened species. And I'm going to quote from the language in the bill. Endangered means that a species is in danger of becoming extinct throughout all or a significant portion of its range. Threatened means that a species is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. All species of animals and plants, with the exception of pest insects, are eligible for listing, end quote. On the website for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, one of the agencies that administers the act, it states that, quote, all federal agencies were required to undertake programs for the conservation of endangered and threatened species and were prohibited from authorizing, funding, or carrying out any action that would jeopardize a listed species or destroy or modify its critical habitat. And that would include the Bureau of Reclamation or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, both of which play roles in the operation of our big dams. By its own admission, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service states that the process for listing a species as endangered or threatened is, quote, cumbersome, complex, and generally misunderstood, end quote. But one of the significant criteria is the present or threatened destruction, modification, or curtailment of the species' habitat or range. In 1978, the Act was modified to enable an Endangered Species Committee consisting of 7 members to issue exemptions to the Act's provision prohibiting new development if 5 of the 7 members agreed to proposed environmental enhancements and other species management strategies. So in other words, if you could mitigate the effect of your project and favor wildlife, you could go ahead and build the project if 5 of the 7 members agree. The first test case for the Modified Act and the Endangered Species Committee was the Tennessee Tellico Dam in 1978. The species in question was the famous snail darter, a fish. The exemption was denied, the dam wasn't built. This committee has met only 3 times since its inception. One of the other 2 times was for the spotted owl case of 1991-92 in Oregon, in which an exemption was granted for a portion of the requested logging area. That exemption was later overturned in court, and I think the people who fought that were later labeled tree huggers, a label that has stuck with many of us for a long time. Yet even with all these environmental protection laws in activity in the 1960s and 70s, there were more proposals circulating at the Bureau of Reclamation for additional impoundments on the North Platte's tributaries. The third Endangered Species Committee case, also in 1978, concerned the proposed Gray Rocks Dam on the Laramie River, a tributary of the North Platte in Wyoming. On the Platte, there are currently 4 listed species, listed under the Environmental Protection Agency. The interior least tern, the piping plover are birds, the pallid sturgeon is a fish. The 4th one, and the one that concerns us at this point in the story, is the whooping crane. In 1950, there were only 50 of these birds left in the wild. Standing nearly 5 feet tall with a wingspan of 7 feet, these birds became the poster children of the endangered species movement in the U.S. Today, there are about 200 in a flock that migrates through Nebraska every spring about the time that the sandhill cranes come through. Before 1870, scientists estimate their numbers at 15,000 to 20,000 birds, with a nesting range across north-central U.S. and Canada. By the 1880s, with settlement reducing habitat and hunting the birds for the millinery trade, there were about 500 left. In 1918, alarm about these and other wild bird numbers declining rapidly from the fashion trade led the U.S. to enact the Migratory Bird Act that prohibited the hunting or trade in any migratory bird or feathers. By 1937, the whooping crane had further declined to about 15 birds, mostly through habitat destruction. That year, the U.S. government established the Aransas Wildlife Refuge in the Texas Gulf Coast as a measure of protection for the birds' wintering grounds, and the birds' numbers started to rebound. Today, under the provisions of the Endangered Species Act, there is an active effort to protect and improve the birds' chances for species survival. One of the measures involves an ESA exemption granted to the Bureau of Reclamation and the Missouri River Basin Power Project, who proposed the Gray Rocks Dam. Again, now, this is the 3rd case in which the ESA committee has met and issued a ruling. In return for permission to build that dam, Missouri River Power and the National Wildlife Federation, who had opposed the dam, were required to work together, a novel thought, with the state of Nebraska to administer the newly created Platte River Whooping Crane Habitat Maintenance Trust. This is the mitigation plan's agency of action. Its purpose is to restore critical migration habitat. In other words, this is what we talked about before. It's mitigating the effect of the dam by restoring habitat along the Central Platte Valley. The trust was funded by a $7.5 million payment from Missouri Basin Power Project. Income from the endowment is used to finance habitat protection, land acquisition, and other programs. The trust has been in existence since that 1978 ruling. Other environmental groups have also joined in the effort to restore habitat, including the National Audubon Society that operates Roe Sanctuary at Gibbon, and the Nature Conservancy that purchases land for habitat restoration along the river. Most of this work takes place in the only stretch of the Platte that resembles the pre-settlement river. That area is roughly from Overton, Nebraska, where the irrigation water re-enters the river channel in the summer months, down to Grand Island. This area is known as the Big Bend of the Platte. Restoration involves creating the open river habitat the sandhill cranes and whoopers need for roosting during the critical weeks when they stop over the Central Flyway on their northward migration each spring. And as a side note, fossil cranes have been found in North America that date back millions of years. The crane migration is an ancient phenomenon. Although the crowding of hundreds of thousands of sandhill cranes and equal numbers of geese and ducks into a 50 to 75 mile stretch of the Platte is indicative of a highly stressed ecosystem, the Great Spring Migration is one of the few things we can still experience today that inspires the imagination to reflect on what the plains must have looked like when the massive herds of bison, prairie wolves, elk herds, grizzlies, and antelope wandered throughout the same area. If you haven't been out to see the cranes, I would strongly urge you to do so. It's as Nebraska as Big Red football, perhaps more so. It is here in Nebraska each spring that the cranes and other bird species gain the body fat necessary to nest successfully in the far north. Typically, these birds gain enough body mass to allow them to nest, lay eggs, and to begin to raise their chicks that hatch at the time that the insects and crustaceans emerge in the north, around the summer solstice. So from late March to the end of June, these birds survive almost exclusively on the nutrients that they absorb and store as fat here along the Platte. For the birds to make use of the river, it has to have open sandbars and shallow water with unimpeded lines of sight. Otherwise, they feel vulnerable and won't roost. That's why the birds come to the Big Bend. It's the only place left that suits their biology. And it is suitable primarily because human beings managed to make it suitable. Every summer, Crane Trust and Audubon employees drive big Caterpillar tractors into the riverbed to remove vegetation using chains they drag over the sandbars. They move quantities of sand to rearrange the channels so that the birds will find roosting conditions critical to their health. For a quarter of a century, the Platte has been managed in this kind of Band-Aid maintenance of the over-allocated status quo fashion. But beginning in 1997, it became apparent that forces were at work that would challenge the effectiveness of this approach here and elsewhere. The primary factor here was the 60-year relicensing of Kingsley Dam through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The original license was issued in 1937 to Central Nebraska Public Power and Irrigation District. And I'm going to quote from the Federal Energy Regulating Commission's 1998 webpage concerning the dam relicensing. Quote, over the next decade, the operating licenses for 250 hydro dams built in the 1930s and 40s will expire. In the West alone, that's approximately 2/3 of non-federal hydropower capacity. As operators approach FERC to renew their long-term licenses, they find that Americans don't look at dams simply as the engineering marvels as we did in the heyday of the New Deal. End of quote. That would have signaled something. In 1997, Edwards Dam on the Kennebec River in Maine was not renewed in a case involving an endangered fish, and the dam was ordered to be removed. A new era was dawning. The dam was breached on July 1st, 1999. Regarding Nebraska's Kingsley Dam, the FERC said this, quote, for 20 years, people pointed fingers. Nothing changed. Tensions grew. It took the formal FERC relicensing process to bring Interior, that's the Department of the Interior, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, the EPA, environmental organizations, and over 50 other parties together to hammer out a solution which would restore river habitat for wildlife. Once again, on a scale unprecedented in conservation history, the FERC process was the catalyst to end the stalemate. What is emerging in each of these cases is an entirely new style of regulation. Your process is moving beyond the narrow confines of a quasi-judicial process, encouraging all stakeholders to work out their differences and to find inventive new ways to share and maximize the water resource for all. A key ingredient in these successes is FERC's willingness to consider, where the facts warrant it, denial of relicensing and decommissioning of dams. End of quote. And this from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's page, quote, over the past 20 years, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has determined that many water projects in the Platte River Basin have jeopardized the existence of these 4 threatened and endangered species by altering riverine and nearby habitat along the central and lower Platte in Nebraska. Leaders from the states of Wyoming, Colorado, and Nebraska and the Department of the Interior, along with water user and environmental group representatives, believe that the best way to address these impacts is through a basin-wide cooperative effort to improve river flows and land habitat for the targeted species. This was the basis for the cooperative agreement which the states and Interior signed in 1997, end quote. Now one can hear a distant voice from John Wesley Powell somewhere in the background of all this. But the details of that cooperative agreement and how it is to be implemented are only now being defined, almost a decade after Kingsley's 60th anniversary date for relicensing. If the cooperative agreement is not implemented, each water project in the affected states will have to provide required mitigations individually, and that no doubt will be more costly and difficult. So the groups have joined together to form the Platte River Endangered Species Partnership. Between 1997 and the present, the partnership has developed 4 alternate proposals to restore habitat. The first is called the Governance Committee Alternatives, and it combined elements of the other 3. The second is called the Water Leasing Alternatives, and it relies on buying back water rights from irrigators and other users. The third is called a Wet Meadow Alternative, and it relies on restoration of wetland habitat in the riverine environment. And the fourth is the Water Emphasis Alternative, which is to increase reservoir storage capacity. These are all discussed in great detail in the draft environmental impact statement, which is available online. In August of 2004, a public comment period about these proposals ended. Soon, one of them will be adopted and become the new Recovery Implementation Program for managing the Platte. So it would appear that yet another new era is about to begin. The key to each of the new plans is the concept of adaptive management. Adaptive management means adjusting the plan as we go to meet changing conditions. It also could provide political wiggle room when it becomes apparent that the various parties will not get everything they want. In a most negative view, adaptive management could mean unending bickering and stalling. In a positive view, it could mean an ongoing dialogue among the various stakeholders and a sense of shared responsibility. Once adopted by the parties, over a 13-year first increment, the plan is to do the following: improve land and water habitat for target species to assist in their conservation and recovery, ensure the effects of future water development activities are offset so that they are not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of the species, provide greater regulatory certainty for water users by providing ESA compliance for existing and new water development projects, help prevent the need to list more species as endangered or threatened, and to accomplish these objectives in a basin-wide, comprehensive, and collaborative fashion that will help ensure that the program's actions are coordinated and effective. Cost estimates range from, when this was written, from $50 million to $180 million, depending on which alternative was selected. Costs will be shared 50% from the 3 states and 50% from the federal government. Each plan creates economic impacts in 4 basic ways: through changes in water management, habitat restoration activities, payments to water users, and program construction activities. Some impacts are positive, others are negative. Depending on the plan selected, irrigated agricultural acres will decrease in a range from 1,400 to 49,000 acres. The value of agricultural products could be reduced anywhere from between $200,000 to $18 million. The alternatives provide water for the program through 2 basic means: the establishment of environmental accounts in Pathfinder Reservoir and Lake McConaughey, and through the voluntary leasing of water from water users. Flows to benefit wildlife could increase between 130,000 to 150,000 acre feet. Construction activities include increasing the storage capacity of Pathfinder Dam and other dams and wet meadow restoration. Construction activities could be the lion's share of cost, budgeted at $101 million in one of the plans, and bringing some short-term economic benefits to those regions. Once a final environmental impact statement and biological opinion are prepared, and that was originally scheduled to take place in 2004, the Secretary of the Interior will reach a decision on whether the Department of the Interior will enter into an agreement to initiate a recovery implementation program. Each state governor will make a decision whether to join in an agreement. The state legislatures and the U.S. Congress will make decisions on funding. And here's the update. The Platte River Recovery Implementation Program final environmental impact statement was filed with the EPA on May 18, 2006. The Platte River Biological Opinion was released June 20, 2006. The Secretary of the Interior, currently Dirk Krempthorne, signed a record of decision for the final environmental impact on the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program on September 28, 2006, approving Interior's participation in a $300 million now basin-wide effort to improve habitat for the 4 threatened and endangered species that use the Platte River in Nebraska. The governors of Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming must also sign the agreement to implement the program. Let's bring it up to date. Governor Heineman has indicated he will decide whether to sign prior to the election, so look for a decision in the coming weeks. This morning's Journal Star, and this was a few days ago, this was October 11th, this morning's Journal Star had an additional story buried on about the 3rd or 4th page local about the Grand Island-based Central Platte NRD asking Heineman to wait an additional week so that an engineering firm that they had contracted with could provide new figures on cost to Nebraska. The governor's spokesperson indicated that it was unlikely that he would delay making his decision. I believe that as this process works its way towards completion and as public awareness of the details increase, there will be a rise in political pressure in both directions. I think you're already seeing that. I believe that after 6 years of debate and a lot of political capital already invested, some version of the process will be completed. The Bush administration has been less than friendly to environmental groups and issues, but even staunchest pro-development, pro-irrigation forces realize that the river is currently over-appropriated and that the environmental issues are not going to go away. Recently, and partially in response to the anticipated implementation of the cooperative agreement, Roger Patterson, who was Nebraska's former Director of Water Resources, but he was active when this decision was made, and himself a former career Bureau of Reclamation bureaucrat, issued a moratorium on new irrigation wells in some western Nebraska counties, provoking outrage from irrigators. Patterson is no longer Director of Water Resources, but Ann Bleed, Nebraska's current Interim Director of Water Resources, issued stays on applications in the Lower Loop NRD in 2006, and the Lower Loop feeds into the Platte. In today's Lincoln Journal-Star article, Dave Aiken, a water law expert from UNL, noted that local NRDs continued to allow irrigators to drill new wells in the years after the state had already agreed to stop any more net depletions of the Platte water after 1997. If Heineman signs the agreement, look for a protracted fight over who will pay to take the necessary acres out of irrigation and over the relation between pumped groundwater, surface irrigation, and in-stream flows in the Platte Valley. Heineman, Bleed, and others like them in Colorado, Wyoming, and the federal government are going to need to know what we think of their actions. But first, we need to know what we ourselves think about the Platte River and what its future should be. That's the end of my talk. Thank you. And I am not an expert on these issues, but if you have questions, I will try to answer them or point you in a direction where you can get your answer. Yes, sir.
Is Nebraska refilling of the Ogallala Aquifer?
Pardon?
Do you have anything in print on the refilling of the Ogallala Aquifer? As it is drained, it refills?
I don't have any information about that. I'm sorry. I assume that most of the refilling of the Ogallala Aquifer would have to take place through groundwater recharge, but I'm not a water expert. Yes. The other two governors might have a better idea than I do. The October 11th article may have some information in it about that, or the website may have as well. Okay, if there are no other questions, thank you very much. I have some of my cards here if any of you want to get in touch with me. We will also make available on the television broadcast of this lecture the website information in case you want to look up more details yourself.
And one last comment. The taping of this lecture today was made possible by funding from the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation. Thank you all for coming.